Hey folks, welcome to Snowpal Podcast. Our guest today is Alex Morris. Alex is a Chief Tribe Officer and a multi-time founder and one of the leading voices in the code generation. Alex, thanks for taking the time to chat.
Yeah, I love that you call it the code generation. I think we are in the generation of autonomous code.
I'm super stoked to learning everything that you're doing, and more importantly, how you're doing whatever it is that you're doing. Because you mentioned, when I asked you for a rough, like a ballparkish topic, you suggested full self-driving for software. You know what? Let's start there. But before we start there, maybe if you could give a brief introduction about yourself, Alex, and your business to our audience, and then we can get into the topic.
Sure. So I'm the Chief Tribe Officer. I'm Alex Morris. I'm the head of the organization Tribe Code, which is basically the best group of indie hackers that we could find who know how to use AI agents. And there's something that we all have in common, which is about a year and a half to 2 years ago, somewhere in the middle of 2024, we all kind of had the same moment of realization that we were going to be obsolete in just a couple of years. This is because we all tried Cursor and we realized, oh my God, being able to move a button on a website is no longer a skill. That's something that the computer can do faster than we can. And that was a big moment. And I think we all reacted very severely to that, which is why we're together on Tribe now. There's now about 8 of us, and we are some of the best software engineers with agents in the world, I would say. We build projects for people, and we also build our own in-house tools. And this is something that I think also has now extended beyond just what you can do with software. So the last month or so, the big announcements came out from Anthropic and also from Pete Steinberger on Twitter. Pete Steinberger first launched the Claude bot, so he was out a little bit before Anthropic, and then Anthropic came out right away with the Claude Cowork product. Both of these tools, if you haven't used them yet, are like incredible at automating everything that happens on your computer. I have mine checking my Gmail right now while we're recording. It's filtering all my inbox and like going through and sending out some replies to people and that kind of thing. So this is kind of the world we live in now. Everything can be done by robots, and that's what we believe in. It's full self-driving. But we're the tribe. That's the idea.
Okay. I think that's a great introduction. I had a lot of conversations with a lot of founders in the recent past. And as somebody who's running a startup and adjusting to a lot of these changes myself, I have a number of things to ask you, right? And then the good thing is asking questions is a lot easier, a whole lot easier, not even comparable to answering them. So you're going to have to humor me for the next 50 minutes or so, but I'm very, very excited to have this conversation. Particularly given the background you just mentioned there. The recent conversations I've had with a lot of people, Alex, it speaks to what you said there, which is in the middle of 2024, you said there was the realization that, a lot of us as software engineers would soon be obsolete, right? Now, people ask me this all the time, right? What does it mean, right? I mean, fear or anxiety. And I had a recent conversation with somebody who shared his side of the spectrum in terms of what things are. To somebody who's been living under a rock, and maybe they were a software engineer, a good one, and let's pretend that they were living under a rock for the last 2 years, and then they've come out into the open. What are some of the things that you might tell them to catch them up with what's been happening?
I think the number one thing is don't be afraid. This is really exciting. I think the number 2 thing is if anybody tells you they know what's going on, they're probably lying. The thing that I've noticed the most here is I think probably you won't get replaced by an AI because AI don't have judgment and they can't join a conversation with your team, right? The big reason that you want an engineer over an AI is that engineers have really good judgment and they're good at communicating. They can be part of a group of other people making a decision together. And you kind of really want to be part of that like corporate meat brain. The group of people in the room talking about what to do with the AI, very fun. I think the final piece is you're not going to get replaced by an AI explicitly. You'll get replaced by someone using an AI. So it's definitely a good time to upskill. But the good news is upskilling is really easy. They've made it extremely easy to install things like Claude Code, and you can use them in the terminal wherever you're normally comfortable.
Okay. So you said a number of things there. I want to go, dissect them one by one. The first thing is this person who's living under a rock, back to that person. They did build software for a number of years, and here they're coming to you and saying, Alex, what should I be doing differently from what I did earlier? I mean, it doesn't matter if they're a full stack or a front end or a back end developer, but if it does help the conversation, feel free to assume a type of work that they would have potentially done 2 years ago. And if they asked you what they should be doing, like what they did 2 years back, and what they should be doing completely differently, what would some of your answers be to each of those questions?
So I think the one thing that people are going to be in really big trouble for is if you didn't already know how to set up really good testing loops. So personally, I came from the robotics and control systems world. So everything that I did was always test oriented. So we would have a very, very rigorous process. You'd have a full loop end-to-end test. You'd have small modular tests. And that's how you make sure that the thing's actually working like you're expecting it to. Now, if you weren't doing that in the past, it was probably because you were overworked and you didn't have time. Because obviously it'd be a lot easier if you knew the thing was working and it'd be a lot less stressful. The good news is that you can use your agents to basically do all of that hard work and design your tests. But knowing how to set those kinds of things up and planning them out properly really makes a big difference, because otherwise your agents will totally go off the rails.
Okay, so what are some things that that person would have to continue to do that's very similar to what they may have done in the past, and what are one or two things that they would have to do very, very differently? For example, right? You could say, hey, you would be maybe they were using an IDE or maybe they were using VI, doesn't matter to write code. Now they're using a lot of these code generation tools. And where they started generating code 2 years ago could possibly be different. Maybe now you're starting off generating a lot of that code, and maybe you as a developer is not even doing that. Maybe the product manager or the business owner is generating a lot of this code and getting it to a point that it's even functional before it comes to a developer, right? I'm just giving you random examples of things that we are encountering. I just want to get your thoughts on what are some of those things that you've seen.
I would say, first off, we really try to discourage product managers making the code, because if that happens, then it's usually not well tested, per the last statement. And then you end up in a situation where the developer has to rip the whole thing out and keep the UI looking the same, which can be pretty painful for everybody. I think the key thing is you need to give the agents a way to verify that they've actually met your expectations. So if you're if what you're giving the agent is a list of things that you want back, that's not as good as giving the agent a list of things you want back and a list of steps and tests that you want it to pass. So an example would be you can set up agents with Playwright and Puppeteer now, and they can click through all the buttons on a website and make sure that all the buttons work. And they can even watch the script on the back end and actually verify that the logs match what they expected to happen with the button. And if you get them to think through their tests like that, they can plan things out amazingly well. They're, I think the best way to think of it is they're very good pattern matchers. So it's kind of like that game that they give children where you have to put the round peg in the round hole and the triangle in the triangle hole and that kind of thing. The agents are really good at those kinds of problems, but if you don't give them the right information up front, then they have a really hard time doing that. The other thing that I think people are probably not seeing fully right now is the number of MCP tools that are available out there. So I automate all kinds of things that you wouldn't expect. I even have an automation with a bunch of different BD tools where when I work with somebody, I immediately know a bunch of contact information for them. I can automatically go add them on LinkedIn. There's little details like that that are really helpful, I think, for the knowledge worker side of the spectrum. And in the developer world, I think it's mostly about freeing up your time to think through how to structure the problem. Because usually a product manager won't know how to structure the broader constraints of the system. So they might be able to give you a spec for what the customer wants, but they're not going to think about like how to make sure that that code works. That's still something that like human engineers seem to have a unique ability to do. And actually, usually we learn it by PTSD, right? We've spent so many times going and debugging something for 20 hours that, the next time that we start out doing it, we think, oh, wow, I got to make sure this thing works from the beginning. I think everybody's been through the same experience where the first project that you build, you write way too much code without testing it fully. And then you have this huge code base and you have to go and look through and add like console logs and prints all over the place to make sure that your code actually is working properly. And it's about like kind of avoiding those situations where you're hunting for the bug and knowing that, the bug came from this module and everything else is working properly. The good news is the agents can do all of that for you, though, which makes it really easy.
Okay, there's a number of things there. I'm going to some of the things you said there, Alex, even the ones I do agree, I'm going to pretend to not agree to some of them, just play the devil's advocate, just so we get both sides of the story on both sides. One of the things you said was product managers, right? Writing code. I mean, I just took that as an example role, but let's say it's a business owner, a non-coder, or somebody who's not generally part of the core software engineering team per se, from a development standpoint. Prior to agents and AI, they would have actually given you requirements in some way, form, or shape, right? How it happens, there's a wide variety of ways it could happen, depending on the size of the company, the type of work you're doing, where you're located. The way it happens on the West Coast is different from a lot of the other parts of the country and from different parts of the world as well, right? But regardless, there was a certain set of things that were done generally, right? Requirements, handwritten or generated or whatever in English For the
Mhm.
most part, handed over from one person to the other. It came to the developer who then literally either wrote the first line of code or had something generated at that point. Now, I feel like it's too late if it came to me as a developer and there was no code. So I don't care whether you're a product manager, a business owner, or a founder, whoever you are, should I still be receiving requirements that's not executable? Now, again, you said that it's probably buggy, it's not ready. I'm not saying it's production ready code. I'm just saying, should I even be entertaining requirements in plain English anymore as opposed to expecting code functional that actually has taken the problem 50% or more of the way there? That's my question.
Yeah, so Mark Andreessen has this great little rant that he does. I've seen him recorded saying this a few times. Um, it's about an onion. So the idea is that every business, every feature, every component that you ever produce is like an onion. And there's layers of risk associated with it. So there's the business risk of like, can we sell this thing? There's some operations risks around like, does it cost too much to sell this thing? Are we going to have enough margin to be able to cover marketing? There's communications risks, like is it actually like something that we can take out to a customer and have them understand what it's going to be? Is it the thing the customers are asking for? But then, within the engineering department, there's the risk of like, is this something that we can reliably scale and provide to all of our customers at the same time? If we deploy the script the way it's written right now, is it going to crash all of our servers? Is it going to cause some race condition in our database and have a bunch of data get wiped or something like that? Is it going to open up a security vulnerability? There's a lot of these kind of different layers of the process that have to be brought to the agent in order for the agent to do a good job. We kind of think of this as a constraint-based system. So rather than what we used to do in the past, which is say, aspirationally, there is this mountain over here and we want to climb up to the top. That would kind of be like a feature spec in the past. We want to go up to the top of the mountain, we want to put a flag down, and we've got to go up this path so that we can stop here, here, and here on the way. That's kind of how we used to do product development. Whereas I think more what we have now with generative AI is this ability to define the problem and define the constraints of the system, and then have the AI fill in the cracks appropriately so that we have the thing that we want by framing it, which is a lot more like trying to kind of fill in a mold, like plastic injection molding. We're all familiar with. You put a mold on, and then you inject plastic into it, and you got the shape. And that's how we get those children's toys that are like inflated from the inside out, and they're like a perfect sealed thing. And there's a lot of those kinds of things out there where what you can do with the agents is a lot more effective if you don't spend too much time specifying details, but instead specify the constraints and the limitations of what you don't want in the system. And then what you'll end up getting back is usually even a better product than you could have produced with your whole team at full capacity. Because you're including all the constraints that the people on the team know about, and then you're letting the agents go and research all the options. We've even tried this with like hardware projects recently. So we've had a number of hardware projects where we've been able to go and research procurement, find all the different components, actually test the components in a simulated environment, and then only after that did we even bring people to come and look at the plant. And we were able to get really good results that way. It was kind of incredible. So a couple of recorded phone calls, and then suddenly we had a hardware plant.
Wow. So, okay, can you take an example, a real one or a manufactured one, does not matter. How would you, as a team, as a person, as an engineer, have approached that problem and the building of that software prior to AI, agents, and everything else that you're using today that's making it faster, quicker, and better? If you could just take that example and we'll walk through the sequence of steps that you would have done earlier versus how you do them now, so we can sort of compare and contrast the differences.
Sure. So the very basic example, let's talk about like just making a website for somebody. So we're going to choose a framework for the front end. We're going to choose a deployment strategy. So we're going to put it up on some hosting so people can access it in the public world. And we're going to have to set up the domain name, set up emails, all that kind of stuff. It's like kind of the most basic use case that you can imagine. In that scenario, under the normal environment with people, a human would decide, oh, well, I'm familiar with this deployment strategy. I'm familiar with this tool. I'm familiar with this way of doing it, so I can get it done a lot faster. Agents don't have that problem. Agents are just as familiar with the thing that came out yesterday as they are with the thing that they've been using for 5 or 10 years. There is some variance depending on how you train them. So like most models currently are actually a lot worse at Go than they are at Python, as an example. And with JavaScript, they're on kind of par with Python. And then if you go into Rust, it's kind of like down closer to Go, because these languages don't have as much open source code, so they haven't been trained on it as much. The thing that's most important with this stuff, though, is if you give that model a URL, to a page that has sample code, or if you tell the model to use the internet and go look for some sample code on how to do this, look for the open source repo with the most stars and the most forks that says how to do this thing. The agent can go and research something completely unknown to you and can actually jump into that problem as an expert almost instantly. And that's a huge difference to how humans perceive information, because for us, there's a lot longer time period to be able to be comfortable with the information before you can act on it with confidence. Whereas the agent is almost 100% acting with confidence all the time, because it's really all it's doing is pattern matching. Whereas people have this kind of a gut feeling. We have this animalistic instinct on whether or not we trust our own solution that we're providing. And the agents really don't have that problem. So they can onboard to things a lot faster. They can provide documentation as well for people about why they made certain decisions. A big part, I guess my soft shell here, a big part of what we do at Tribe now is observability for agents. And so we can actually observe all of the different coding agents in your fleet. So if you have, let's say you have 20 engineers working, they each have 5 or 6 Claude codes, they have cursor up. So all these different agents looking at the code base and making different decisions. Our kind of bread and butter has become monitoring all of that and being able to identify why the agents are making certain decisions so that people can ask better questions. And what we found is the better questions that you ask, the better the agents perform. And you can get like really high performance, like kind of 10x developer level capacity in parallel on like 5 agents on your computer.
Okay, I'm just jotting down quickly so I can follow through. So sorry if you hear those clicks.
Sure.
So you took the example of website, right? The first question I have is, when we talk agents, or particularly when we talk large language models, at least the high level, they're very good and they're getting better and better at doing things that have been done in the past, right? So your example was building a website, right? There's a billion of them. So there is not necessarily a new set of thinking process that needs to come into play, right? If you're building a website, unless that person wants it to be so dramatically different from the 3 billion out there, it's mostly going to be doing maybe the same sort of, to a large extent, right? Things that other ones are doing. So that's one part of the problem. But solving unique problems, how do you do that separation? Like when you have a business problem that you need to solve and build software for that, how do you separate the pieces and parts that have been done a dozen times, a million times? So there should be no element of thinking that needs to go into that, and probably something that could be delegated in entirety to an agent, versus something else that actually requires human intervention, either periodically or at the beginning or in the middle or at the end, does not matter, whatever those frequencies happen to be, but that does need, those interventions need to be there. I mean, do you separate these two pieces? I mean, is there value in making that separation? If not, what is your general approach in, doing what's been done before versus what might be a unique problem that you might have to solve as a team or as an engineer?
Sure. So I think there's 2 different things going on here. I think what you're describing is a really important part of how humans currently solve problems, which is like, let's say that we want to go to Mars, right? Well, we need rockets. So we start reasoning about the problem. We come up with the different components. We start making a plan, or maybe even something simpler. There's a river and the car wants to drive across the river. You want to be able to build something so the car doesn't fall in the river. Maybe you want to dam up the river. There's a few different ways to do it. What agents are really good at is telling you about all the things that you have and whether you can connect those things together to get the solution you're looking for. What they can't do is tell you how to fix it when there's a hole in the problem. And so one of the key things that we've identified is when you watch the agent's stream of reasoning, which is basically like in the foreground of an agent chat, you have a chat interface like ChatGPT, where there's a bunch of different things happening in order. That doesn't necessarily mean you're seeing the agent's whole brain. And you can subscribe to their telemetry, and you can see all of the actual reasoning events that are happening in the background when you're talking to that agent. And as you're doing that, you can actually critique it. So the best thing that we've come up with, in fact, the first piece that we kind of all agreed on the Tribe side, was that you need an agent to monitor and audit everything that any of your agents does. And the reason for this is that's how you identify those blind spots and those missing pieces. And when you do that correctly, not only do you get a better result than people would have given you, but you're also able to get your people to be incredibly productive towards solving the actual problem. And that's actually what we usually see in innovation in the real world. If you take an example of of SpaceX, actually, in terms of the Mars thing, SpaceX had the novel innovation of being able to land the rockets, because it would be very expensive to go to Mars without being able to land rockets. And for whatever reason, it took almost 50 years before 50 years from the first time that humans went to the moon to the time when we decided that it was important for us to start landing rockets. which is a very, very long time if you consider that we were all talking about going to Mars that whole time, right? But it took a really long time for anybody to say, oh, well, there's something missing here. Why are we all talking about it this way? What I found with the agent loopbacks is that you can identify that missing piece in the puzzle very quickly. There is the constraint, though, and this is why I said the thing about having the product manager not write code. As soon as the product manager starts to write code, then what they've done is they've actually gone and created a whole bunch more unknowns. And now the engineer isn't being helpful in terms of identifying, how to land the rocket or how to cross the river, but is instead being helpful in terms of identifying what's wrong with what the product manager did. Does that
Okay.
make
So no, it makes sense. Let me ask you this. So how do you see the software development life cycle as having changed today, right? If you could walk us through specifically those steps, like let's say if the product manager does not need to write code, let me step back actually, Alex. The composition of a software engineering team compared to 2 years ago, right? Let's say I took a sprint team with 3 developers, a tester, a part-time, project manager slash scrum master, a part-time DevOps engineer, some combination of these roles. Let's say a team happened to have these couple of years back. How do you change the comp? I have a bunch of questions there, but the first question is, what is the composition of a typical software team that you see or that you folks have, and that how different is that from what it was like a couple of years back?
So I think it's actually almost exactly the same. I think the velocity is just a lot higher. So one of the things I would note is when you go to set up a repo now, your boilerplate choice is really important. Because if you set up your agents and so on in the repo, they're actually adding information into your code base about how they've thought about things. And so the more that you can get that down to like an absolute kernel of truth at the very beginning and have that initial first prompt be really clean, the better that the long-term outcomes of the agents will be. Once everything's all set up and the basic MVP has been shipped and everything's
No,
good to go.
actually, hang on, Alex. I'm sorry. I'm going to interrupt you here because I want to walk through these steps very slowly, right? So
Sure.
let's say you're talking to a client, right? Maybe you're building a product for your own company or you're doing a consulting work for a different client, right? Like a managed service. Doesn't matter. How does that initial interaction look like? Like somebody says, hey, Alex, I want to build software. Maybe, I'm going to take a really simple example, right? Something has been done a billion times, which is, something like DoorDash. You want to order food, you're maybe building a mobile app to be able to order food, and maybe you're doing something different about that particular app because, someone told me that there are like, I don't know, 50 different delivery apps in like Bangalore in one small city, not small, one city in India or something along those lines, right? So I want to take that example. Let's say somebody comes to you and says, I want to build an app for delivering food. How does that initial interaction look like? I'm the customer, you're the business helping me build that software. What does our initial interaction look like today?
Sure. I'm going to tweak the example slightly. If you came to me and you said you wanted to build Uber, and then you also told me about how later on you want to build Uber Eats, and you also want to build, let's say, Uber Electric and Uber Bike and all these other options that are all part of that plan, that's where we start to thin down the plan. So that's the same as the current, best practices Silicon Valley mantra, which is you kind of do things in the minimal way that you can to satisfy a particular customer need. That's all the same, I think. I think the difference is in the past, we would have sat down and whiteboarded things with people. There would have been a lot of like face-to-face interaction or like video call interaction. We would have had long conversations and specs would have been exchanged as documents. Whereas now, a lot of the time, we can get that initial scoping and spec delivery down to like 2 phone calls. And as long as we have the transcripts from those 2 phone calls and the calls are curated well, usually the first call is very loud. In the sense that there's a lot of noise. There's everybody trying to say all the things that they think are important, and then it's about like kind of pruning that down and going back to the drawing board after we have all that information. So in the past, we would have spent a lot of time on speccing things out. We would have gone to a UI UX development kind of mode. We would have created a whole bunch of mock-ups. We would have shown those back to the customer. That would have taken weeks on almost every case. The difference would be that now kind of what we do is we have the initial meeting with a client. They tell us all the things that they would love to do. We go back, we identify kind of like a rough scope for each of those, and then we send back basically from a transcript of that first call and kind of pruning that down. We send back a list of things we think we can do and the order that we would propose doing them in, which on our end is mostly an agentic process. So we have a bunch of agents that know how to do that. We've spent like months training and making sure that they're tight. Once that goes back to the client, then they have the freedom to actually now act on that. The way they act on that is they tell us, okay, well, this is the thing that I think is the highest priority. We start from there, and we start with a really clear mission statement, a really clear picture of exactly how this product is going to feel to an end customer. And we try to generate all of that immediately and then get sign off on it. Once that's done, the user stories are complete. We don't even go to a UX step. We don't do any UI UX designs up front. There's no wireframing, anything like that. We just generate the first version of the app and we send it back to the customer and see if they like it. And that process can be done in under a week usually.
Okay, lovely, right? Number of specific things you mentioned. I really appreciate the specificity of your answers because, a lot of our audience is predominantly engineers, and business owners running companies. But I think the specificity of those answers are going to be very helpful to people. Like, remember I said, I'm going to play the devil's advocate. I'm going to do it everywhere I get an opportunity here. You said things that, you laid out how it actually will work. It makes a lot of sense. But you also qualified that saying, it's the composition of the teams have not changed, right? The velocity has increased. Now, I appreciate that, but here's my question. The client 2 years ago would have come to you with requirements and ideas in mind, right? Hey, I want to do this. I want to solve this problem. I think there is a need for this. Maybe I did my research, due diligence, yada, yada, yada. And I'm convinced that I want to be able to build this and I have some money to build it. So I need help building this, correct? That's sort of how it worked 2 years ago. But now, a lot of what you mentioned there, right? Speccing things out, creating mock-ups to show it to the customer, having those initial conversations, transcribing them, identifying the rough scope, coming up with a list of things and, prioritizing those. Why should I, again, I'm playing the devil's advocate. Why should I, as a customer, even have a company that I'm paying for do this for me? Because while they are using ChatGPT and a lot of these other agents and whatnot, I have all of them available to me as well as a customer, right? So it's people have asked me, right? If people went to a lawyer with knowing nothing earlier, now they figure out 90% of the way they're there. They just go try to find the lawyer to do the last part of the process because you need to pass the bar, maybe to show up in court or something. So my real question there is, why should the client come to a company or a managed services provider to do any of those things that we just spoke there, as opposed to them doing it themselves and coming to the client, the provider with just, hey, start writing code for me?
Yeah, so you mentioned the legal use case, which I highly empathize with. I have friends and even family members who are in the law profession. I think, and actually I would extend this to accountants as well, or even doctors, actually. You can do a lot of preventative medicine. You can do a lot of upfront accounting principles and bookkeeping. You can do a lot of legal stuff upfront yourself. If you do not consult with a professional before you do that, they will probably be upset with you when you go to speak with them. And the reason is pretty much the same across the board. I think the same would apply to carpentry. It would apply to electrical work. If you don't consult with a professional who understands the market and actually knows what the long-term outcomes of these small decisions will be upfront, then what you're going to run into is the professional is going to have to fix a lot of things. And as a professional, and knowing lots of other professionals in these various fields, I can say that they confidently will charge you quite a bit more to undo your bad work than it would cost them to just do it right in the first place, especially with agents. And so in the case of software, if we just zoom back to the software case, the thing that's going to happen here is if you go and set up this entire project yourself, and then you go to somebody as a professional to audit the work or double check it or fix it, what they're going to have to do is throw out most of what you did. And it's going to be a lot harder than if they just sat down with you in the first place. So I think I would kind of put that in the category of like, you can play with the finger paints yourself. And then you can get a rough draft going and then take that to like DaVinci and DaVinci can finish it for you. Or you can just go to DaVinci and ask him to paint the portrait. And if you let him be free in that process, you're probably going to get a much better outcome than if you try to do it all yourself in the first place. And I would say that there's definitely a role here in terms of like having the client pay for ChatGPT or Claude Code or one of these products. But I think what they should be trying to do here is to get an expert to use that product in each particular vein. Because the choice of language that I will have if I work with ChatGPT and the way that I'll design my process, and this is true for almost all the engineers that I know, the way that we will think through our process is going to be really specific to our scope. So even within our team, we have very specific domain expertise across different channels. So we have people who are experts at go-to-market. We have people who are experts at SEO. We have people who are experts at design engineering. Like one of the ones that we recently just did, we had Nano Banana hooked up in a loop, regenerating design elements. And so Claude Code was using the Nano Banana API to generate design elements in a loop and then reviewing them using Playwright and then sending that back to Nano Banana to ask for feedback and getting Gemini involved. And there's like all these layers that are going on. But in order to do that, you have to know what you want as a designer in the first place to kick that off in the right way. But if you do know how to do that and you've done it before, you can do it at a much greater scale this way. And I think that's kind of where like most of these like expert driven processes will really actually have a stronger moat than people realize. I'm sure that like, getting a basic MVP for your startup, fine. But if you want to have like a high quality production product for 1 million people, it's going to be very different.
Fair enough, right? But just to clarify, what I was trying to say there is not so much them doing every bit of everything. I was just saying that the initial interaction that they would have had with scoping the requirements, creating mock-ups and wireframes and all of those things, a lot of it they can still do it, right? Long story short, when a client came to a provider, a managed services provider 2 years ago to get stuff done and needed help, they could only go so far because they were probably not engineers necessarily. They didn't have developers, though they had to rely on developers to do everything. But things have changed quite a bit now where they can come to the developer with a lot of it already being done. I'm not saying they've done everything, but I'm saying they would have done a lot more than they could have possibly been able to do 2 years prior.
I know what you mean there. I do actually, because I can remember in the past people coming to me and describing their idea with words. And this happened a lot. And they would come and they would describe something in like great detail over a phone call, even without like a video call, right? So they're just speaking into a phone and telling me what they're looking for. Maybe this is like 8 years ago or something.
Right.
But it took them a long time to explain it to me. Whereas instead now what they can do is they can spend an hour or two with ChatGPT and they can get those mock-ups and wireframes in advance. You're right on there actually. We used to spend a lot of time. I remember building websites in high school, which was a while back, and we were getting people to go and look for basically like comparable websites that they really liked to give us some concept. And now what I do instead is I take the phone call that we had with them and I send them back 5 versions of their site almost immediately. To give them some idea of the different stylistic elements, and I still ask them if there's like example sites that they'd like to look at, but I can also send them a bunch of examples based on like what I know about them, what they told me on the call, all that kind of stuff. So it definitely speeds up that communication process. It seems like actually, to extend what you're saying, I think getting ideas from my head into somebody else's head and vice versa is a lot faster than it used to be. Which
Correct,
is pretty
right? And makes sense. And taking that a step forward, like I said earlier, they had to, I was talking to a founder not too long ago who actually had never written any code, right? She was a UI designer, but had never written any code at all in her career. She had an idea and she wanted to go build a piece of software to solve that problem, right? She was able to take that idea as a non-developer and not even hire a software engineer. She said she found 2 people in college who were in the second year in college, give or take. So they hadn't actually graduated yet or nowhere close with their very first diploma. And she was able to take the problem and build a solution, take it to production, right? And I can say that this was almost impossible prior to AI generating code. You had to go look for funding. You needed to get some money from somebody to doing this. So things have changed dramatically, right? Not just a little bit, they've changed sizably. But what it also means is, I asked her, hey, how do you perceive the need for software engineers going forward as a founder and who's starting to monetize through the business that you built without hiring a single quote unquote software engineer, at least one who's graduated and got this formal title? Her point was, I don't know if I need, I'm paraphrasing what she said, Alex, but the point was, I don't know if I need, people to have gone to college or graduated or done this for 3 years or 5 years, or it doesn't even matter if they are software engineers. If they are good problem solvers who know how to use a lot of these tools, I think they're good enough for me, right? So in other words, Mike, keeping that in mind, right? Hopefully you agree with some or all of that. But if you do, how does it change the life of a software engineer? Because when somebody came to me, Krish, I've been doing this for like 20 some years, right? I had to help them write code. Now I don't need to help them write code because they can generate a lot of that code before they come to me. So the sort of, what you take to the table from a negotiating standpoint, right? The dynamics have changed as a software company, as a software engineer. How do you see this pan out? How important do you think software engineers are versus problem solvers? Somebody who was able to understand a problem and solve it better versus somebody who was able to write code better earlier. I have a few follow-up questions, but I want to get your initial thoughts on this separation.
Sure. So at the beginning, we talked about like the idea of autonomous code, which I think we were definitely headed. And that's the sense that like your code base is probably self-maintaining within 2 or 3 years. But I think that that makes software engineers more valuable, not less valuable. So a good example of this would be kind of like if you think about what it was like to work on a farm before tractors. There were a lot of people there who were involved in a variety of different manual tasks where it was required that a human lifted something or moved something. Because prior to the introduction of tractors, we had horses, and moving a horse around was very complicated. And so the actual work output, like the joules of energy or watts of energy being used, the watts of energy were coming from human backs more so than hydraulic pumps. And that means that there was a certain number of experts that would have been still there after you brought a tractor out. And there's only so many tractors, and it's hard to drive a tractor, and you still need some people around because maybe the tractors can't do everything at first. And I think that's kind of what we're going through. Where like software engineers are now the most experienced group of people in the community of people who know how to play with computers. This is oddly true as well. About a generation ago, everybody got a TV. And so my understanding of how to use a TV remote is significantly better than my parents. And my parents understand a TV remote considerably better than their parents, if that makes sense. And there's a layer of this where each generation is a little bit more tech savvy. But I think this idea that there's going to be massive job displacement in like software engineering is pretty unlikely, actually. Because software engineers mostly are not actually manual laborers. They are subject matter experts in specific task areas. And they're pretty good at keeping themselves up to speed. I know lots of people who are JavaScript, like they were probably, let's say, Angular developers in 2017, and then they became React developers, and now they're Next.js developers, and now they're actually Claude Code driven Next.js developers, which just makes them a lot more productive. And I would say if they keep up with the tool, they definitely won't be displaced in that way. But I do think that anybody who doesn't learn the new tools will probably be displaced.
Okay, so that's an interesting school of thought, right? Now I've heard that, everyone's got a varied set of opinions here. And as a software engineer myself, Alex, I agree with a lot of what you're saying. But I'm going to again pretend to disagree to ask some of these follow-up questions. You mentioned the examples of accountants and lawyers and doctors. Right now, there is a regulatory body, right? Even if you know how to solve a medical problem, but you did not have the certification, the diploma, you didn't have the doctor of medicine, all of the degrees, you're not legally allowed to help anybody, right? Because that's just the way the system works for good reason. Same thing with lawyers, I would imagine, right? I don't understand the whole business, but generally, if you're a lawyer, I think you have to pass the bar and to practice law in a state, and you have to take the bar exam. It changes from one state to the other in the US. But that's just the last part of what they probably have to do. A lot of the research that happens around law, doing the investigations and I don't know whatever else that goes with it, I don't know if there's necessarily a regulatory body that governs it, right? So what I'm trying to ask here is there are certain requirements that you have to satisfy to practice medicine or to practice law. Like it or not, software engineering is not one of those things. I mean, there is no law that says you legally are required to go to college or even go to high school to be able to create software, right? That's not the case, which means the barrier to entry is very, very low, right? It's certainly lower than a lot of the other professions that have a regulatory body per se. Anybody who could write code was a software engineer and was a competition, right? I mean, they may not have gone to the same school that you went to or went to an Ivy League school or had all of those fancy diplomas and experience or degrees and whatnot, but if they could write solid code that performed and could scale and had the least number of bugs, they were competitors to Alex and Krish, right? That's just the way, the truth of the matter. Mm-hmm. Given that, because you mentioned that, there is a need for engineers, and I do not disagree, but the need for the same number of engineers, that's where I want to ask what you think. If there was a need for 1 million developers 2 years ago, talking to a lot of people, I'm getting the sense that you need 50,000 and not 1 million anymore. Do you agree? Whether you agree or disagree, what are your follow-up thoughts on that school of thought?
I think the amount of developer hours required probably stopped going up. That doesn't mean that there's not as much demand, and it doesn't mean that demand will not begin to increase. So I think it's Marshall's law of supply. Is that basically when you have more supply, you can actually increase the demand proportionally. So if you bring the price down by 5%, there's a whole bunch of new buyers who are now interested in doing something. I think we see this a lot with things like Lovable. So there's probably, I think the number is around like 20 million new people who are trying to start businesses using Lovable, who believe they're in a sense now engineers. They're launching their own products. They're probably not as technical as you or I, but they are trying to launch a product in this space where they're making a product that they think can make money by doing some kind of value add. One of the biggest cases I saw there was like a 16-year-old who launched a gym app on Lovable. And he was very, very successful at marketing, and his product did quite well. So he's building a lot of revenue. But the problem with that is eventually he needs to scale that product, which creates a job, at least one job for a developer now. And I think the question is really more at this point. So we'll come back to it. The example here with lawyers would be a really good one as well. I have a roommate, and he sued his last landlord because the guy was kind of a dick, and he was an unpleasant landlord. He was able to sue his landlord because he went on ChatGPT, wrote up all the legal paperwork, and then went into the courthouse himself, which meant that his landlord had to hire a lawyer. I think that's kind of where we're going with this thing, which is like
I think,
the more access to the community there is, the more likely it is that there's going to be this back and forth. And I think software engineers will be kind of more like lawyers in the future, actually. Like you kind of need one because the other people have them. And you need somebody who's a subject matter expert that you have access to. But the more of these businesses that get started online, the better it goes. The only question now is whether or not there's a limited amount of attention for these kinds of new business ideas that are popping up. And it's possible that there is a limited amount of attention for them, and that there is only so much space for human brains to do these kinds of things. I think the other side of it, though, and the argument that Sequoia Capital and others are making is that the limited amount of attention by humans will be replaced by attention by agents, which will still drive economic action. And most likely the products of the future will sell mostly to agents and not so much to people. And that seems to be, that's their thesis for their new, like, I think, $10 billion fund. So it seems like they're going to be putting a lot of money into trying to make that happen.
You know, I love your example there, and I think it's a brilliant point that you make there. I think it hit the right chord with me, and I'm pretty sure that with our audience as well, it will, because, you know, you mentioned, just to recap what you said there, Alex, is new businesses, right? There's room for new businesses to come into play. And I'm hearing this, I'm seeing it, I'm reading about it. So there will be more entrepreneurs than they were in the past, maybe because it takes a lot less money and a lot less skill to get stuff done, right? As long as you have an idea and that's a viable, reasonable, sensible, meaningful one that actually is useful enough, you can go build that business, and more businesses get built. And you mentioned that at least now there's a need for at least one developer, and you gave an example of a law situation where there was at least that need for a single lawyer. So that I think I like completely you articulated that beautifully. But
There is
sorry, go ahead.
one caveat here. I really appreciate the questions you're asking as well. I can see why you have a podcast.
No worries.
Great idea. I think the one caveat is the amount of websites that each engineer builds per year, or the amount of features that each engineer builds per year, is going to change dramatically. So this year, so far, it's the end of January now, and I have now completed over 50 bug fixes, probably like 20 features, and like hundreds of UX improvements at this point, which is crazy, right? Which is a kind of velocity that like previously I would have achieved with a team of 30 people. And every person at Tribe also performs at this level. And so with 8 people, we're probably doing as much like software improvement as Google did last year, or the year before maybe. And actually, I saw a post by somebody at Google who said this. They were building some very complicated orchestrator. And she actually came out, she wrote a whole blog post about it. And she said that, you know, they'd been building this thing for 2 years, and then she threw it into Claude Code, and she had a working prototype the next day. And it meant that there was no deliberations, no meetings. She just got the whole product shipped. She sent it around to her team. They all really liked it. They closed the case, and then they moved on to the next project. And I think it's the closing the case and moving on to the next project that's going to become the determining factor in a software engineer's success in their life.
Okay.
You know?
Yeah, makes complete sense. A couple of related questions and maybe one unrelated one to some extent. For the same job, right? Like I know you said the velocity is increased, so you can do more. I completely understand that. But let's pretend for a second that you had to only get the same number of things done, correct? Let's say you're working at the DMV, for instance, right? The population grows at a certain pace. It doesn't necessarily change dramatically, at least in not many all parts of the world. So you expect to serve a certain number of customers. Let's take that as a simple example, if you will. I have 100 customers showing up during the course of the next 2 hours on a Monday morning at the DMV, and I want to make things better. Now, no matter how fast I do things, I'm not going to get 100 more people, not necessarily, at least in my convenient example. So I only need to cater to 100 people. So my option now is really the only option I can see there in that convenient use case that I created, very selfishly, if you will, is to let go of people who are already working with me because I don't need as many people. So please take that as a very confined, restrictive example and extrapolate that to a software team, except it's not a DMV. So if you had a 10 people, actually 10 is a very small number. Let's make it 100 for ease of math. You had 100 software developers in a company, correct? Maybe a bunch of different teams. You're going to do the exact same number of things. Now, you don't have the luxury of building more features out. How many developers do you need now compared to the 100 that you had yesterday when code was not generated?
I think it's about how big your TAM is. So I think a software business is very different from the DMV because almost every software business I've worked in has a roadmap that includes like $1 trillion target addressable market. That's like most of the time the reason that we fund software companies is because we want them to get into this huge big picture thing where they're.
But Alex, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I want to make this particularly inconvenient and hard, right? There's a reason why I'm asking this. I promise you.
Completely hopeless. I hear you on the DMV. It's actually if it's a fixed population of customers and there's no more customers, then the entire economy stagnates and we have a permanent recession.
So no, in my example, I'm just forcing you, quote unquote, to assume that the TAM does not change, right? So if you had 100 developers and if you were asked to do the exact same set of things with the use of all these tools and agents, how many fewer developers do you think you need?
If you started with 100, I mean, it depends. The primary thing that would depend there is not on how many things you were trying to do, but on how many systems you were trying to monitor. And if it comes down to monitoring systems, you do need to audit most of the decisions that are made. And so it's the number of developers. The number of developers is proportionate to how many decisions are made and how many need to be audited. And that could be, it could be that you still need 100, depending on the scale of the organization. Some organizations are they're very tight like that. Like they already had probably a lean business. I would say actually, if you're in a company with 100 engineers, it's probably fairly lean still. And the reason that they have 100 engineers is because they need somebody to watch the Kubernetes cluster on the weekend or after 5 p.m. And that's like probably the main reason that there's a larger team, is to have coverage and to make sure everybody's relaxed and that it's not stressful. If you're in a smaller startup environment, like a team of 20, that's probably a 5-person company now.
Okay, so which means I asked somebody who was a guest, was running a company in Australia, in Sydney or Adelaide, I don't remember. He said he was able to do the same number of things with 90% less developers in the team, right? And it's a small enough company. He had like small enough, but let's take a large enough company, right? Amazon announced that they're letting go of 15,000 people in the corporate offices, I think today, if I'm not wrong. I saw the news this morning. That's not in the warehouses. That's actually corporate workers, right? I don't know what the split between the developers and non-developers is, but let's say, right, AWS, it is part of AWS, not part of any other division within Amazon. So I don't think the total addressable market is necessarily an issue for AWS because, I mean, I think we can fairly safely assume that is a pretty big number, large number. So if AWS decided to let go of 15,000 people, it's not because of lack of things to do or not because of lack or reduced size of the addressable market. Essentially, it's because they don't need as many people to get stuff done, right? And they're not a small company. So here is an example of a hyperscaler, a $2.5 trillion company that's in the top 5 companies in the world that's building software, has the largest cloud market share, over 30%, and is able to let go of 15,000 people. Which, does that not necessarily mean, Alex, then clearly the need for software developers, all things being said and all of our conversation considered, has actually diminished quite dramatically?
I think it depends on how you think about it. If you're worried about getting fired, the thing I would suggest is, like, not speaking to you personally, but I'd say for any software developer fired, because this is where Tribe came from. About a year and a half or 2 years ago, we all were really worried that we were going to be completely jobless for the rest of our lives. And the reason that we've kind of stuck it through and become experts in using AI to do this job is because we are indispensable now. So if there's going to be layoffs in any business I'm involved in, I'm the last person that they're letting go of. And that's not so much because they it's not because they need me to keep fixing their software. It's because they know that I can fix anything that's involved in their software or any part of their stack. I can, at this point, I've automated pretty much my entire day-to-day flow. I do about as much work as 10 people right now. And that's not all software either. That's BD outreach. That's like strategy planning. That's accounting. There's a whole bunch of different tasks that I've almost entirely automated out of my day-to-day workflow, which are things that I previously would have hired outside for. But I'm also now paying an agent to do those. And there's an extensive market of other people out there that also need to be involved, right? So I still have to hire somebody to check my books at the end of the year. I'm still hiring a bookkeeper. Presumably there will be a lot more companies, so there will still be. If you look at the case of like a bookkeeper, which bookkeepers are not accountants, they're the people that like check your books before it goes to an accountant to rubber stamp it. You would probably imagine that in this case there will be more companies. The question, I think, and to speak to the Amazon layoff, I think the thing that's probably happening there is more likely that there were people who were actors and people who were executing the work. And if you were there executing work but you weren't leading, then it's unlikely that they need you.
So are you referring more to it makes complete sense, but just to clarify, are you talking about mid-level management per se, people who are sort of assigning tasks but not necessarily doing those tasks or contributing to the completion of those activities?
I'm sure that's part of it, though those people are actually still valuable as well, in the same sense that I need to monitor my system, or we need to make sure that the cluster doesn't go down on the weekend. You still need somebody to monitor the team and make sure that they're still showing up for work and not goofing off, or that their mental health is in good shape, right? Because they could be stressed out and overworked. So you still need management. I would say the question is more about whether you can flexibly and with agility jump after a new vertical. And so if you can consistently move into a new vertical and consistently make progress and grow your market share in that vertical, then you wouldn't fire anybody. The only reason that it would make logistical sense to fire somebody probably is somebody that Amazon spent a long time hiring, right? Amazon's well known for having a very stringent hiring policy, so it's extremely hard to get a job there. I don't know if I could even get a job there. Maybe neither of us could get a job there, right? It's really hard to get a job at Amazon. It's like Google now. So the question would be like, if they went through this distinct effort to recruit this person, they paid a recruitment bonus, they trained them, they put all this effort into them. The only reason that they would let them go is if they're no longer able to get that person to go in the direction that Amazon's going next. I would doubt that they're letting them go.
But Alex, that's assuming that I appreciate what you're saying there, right? But the only thing I would say is that's assuming that these large companies exactly know what they're doing. If they did know what they were doing, Reality Labs wouldn't be spending $70 billion running it down the drain every year, correct? So there's a graveyard of products that have never seen the light of day from each and every one of these companies, right? So they've proven time and again that as good as they are quite human too, and that they make the same mistakes or mistakes worse than startups, just that they have the bandwidth and the money to see them through mistakes like Apple cars and Vision Pros and all those cool things, right? No, but I hear you. But I want to follow that up with a question there, which is, say the core competencies of a developer, right? When I started, right, many years ago, my first job, few things that the companies were looking for were the thought process, logical thinking, a number of different things that you had to do as a human to prove that you can write code. But even before you could write code, you could do a number of those things well enough, or better than some other people, or fast enough, or faster than some other people. Now, I want to take some of those as examples and get your thoughts on it. Switching languages and frameworks, right? Going from one language, you mentioned, right? Angular. Hey, Alex, you're still there, right? Okay. Yep. So going from Angular to React to Next.js to something else. When a human has to do this, depending on who you are, how much of what you've done, sometimes it's challenging, sometimes it's not, right? Because you understand the problems and you switch from one language to the other. Yet when businesses did the hiring, they specifically mentioned that they needed Alex to have written Next.js code for 3 years. And a lot of the companies were quite anal about it. If Alex had written React code, which is not using Next.js, or Angular code, which is not React at all, they would choose not to hire Alex because for whatever reason, which I may not agree with, right? It doesn't make sense. Mm-hmm. But those things probably are less important now, right? Because I can write code in one language and have tools translate that code or transcribe it, whatever the right term is, convert it to a different language altogether. And similarly, there's a number of other things that I can think of. Code reviews, where humans had to do code reviews. now agents and bots and all of those things can do code reviews a lot faster, a lot quicker, and can be more seamlessly integrated into the process. So what I'm trying to ask there in a long-winded way is, what are some skills that you think software developers need to have today? I mean, AI awareness and using this is a given, but beyond that, and more specifically, what do you think should be different from the top 3 skills that the developer needed to have 2 years ago versus what they need to have today? What do those top 3 skills be?
Definitely. So the first one has to do with what you described in the hiring selection process. If you're hiring somebody who knows Next.js because you have a Next.js code base instead of somebody who knows React, it's because you don't want to spend the time teaching somebody Next.js. And that's a big deal because what that does then is it bloats your team and it slows down the people who are the most important and can solve that problem. And the last thing you want to do is slow down somebody who can solve the problem to teach somebody who currently can't solve the problem, because that means that it takes longer to solve the problem. So you only really do that when you're in a resting and growing phase, never when you're in an aggressive growth, chasing a market kind of phase. The second thing, so that speaks to the ability to onboard to a new code base and understand the components very clearly. That's really, really important. And something that we look for as well. One of our tests when we onboard people is very much to give them almost no onboarding in a code base and see if they can explain it to us better than we could or find a blind spot that we missed. Which is something that's very easy to do with Claude Code and other tools if you ask them the right questions. But it's about the developer seeking the knowledge and forcing the agent to explain and rationalize itself. And you can actually identify when somebody does this wrong because what they come back to you with is something that's full of hallucinations and doesn't actually reflect reality. And so that's kind of did they ask the question the right way? The second thing I think would be knowing how to follow a process where you can keep your agents from making big mistakes. So it's okay for agents to make small mistakes. We can fix those. But if your agent makes a really big mistake, then you probably go off track and you've wasted a lot of human time now. And human time is very, very valuable in this world because, like you said, we want to reduce the workforce by 90% of the people. So that means that the 10% of people we have left should be expecting to make 10 times more. So human time is now 10 times as valuable if you think in that context. You can do a lot. I think we probably do months of work every week at Tribe, which is a crazy, crazy stat. The thing that's going to make you really productive is being able to manage Git workflows really, really effectively. So it used to be a 10x developer would sling some code every day. They'd knock out a whole bunch of PRs. They'd be the 10x developer sitting there and his code flying off in every direction. It's like a superhero movie or something. That I think is kind of the default now. And so it's more about how organized you are and whether you step on other people's toes. When you step on someone else's toes in this world, it causes them a week of work. Disentangling 7 bad PRs is enough to ruin somebody's day and make them not productive the next day. And that's a really frustrating thing to have happen. So you really want to be very neat and tidy. Git work trees are a really big example of how to do this very efficiently. And then I think the third thing, which kind of falls in line with that, is making sure that you're actually updating documentation as you go in an incremental way. And so it used to be in a previous business, I had a person whose job was to make sure that our documentation and developer-facing materials were really clear. And they were kind of partially DevRel and partially kind of communications role. That role's gone for sure. Everybody's fully expected to document their own code because you can just pull up an extra Claude Code window in parallel and say, document what this guy's doing, which is really easy. And it's so easy that if you don't do it, it's because you said screw you to the rest of the people on the team. I'm too important to do that. I think that kind of ego is actually a very destructive thing in an organization. So to close it out, it's onboarding to a code base really easily, staying really organized with Git and being able to roll back your changes and keep really good track of what's going on. And then the third thing being to be able to structure the work that you're doing in such a way that it's easy for both people and agents to understand what's going on. So if I tie all that up in a nice bow, what I would say is it's about being a conscientious contributor to these projects. Which people who've contributed a lot to open source, I think, have this by default. Because if you throw a pull request up on an open source repo, if you try to contribute to Bitcoin Core, for example, which is a pretty anal group of open source developers, if you do anything on there, it's kind of like going into a new subreddit and trying to say hi. Or it's like going into 4chan and trying to say hi, which you're just going to get assaulted by people who are like, what do you mean? Don't you have anything interesting for us? Why'd you do it this way? And I think that that's an important training for people to go through these days. And I think one of the founding guys from Spec Story, which is a friend of ours and a partner, he's a really, really interesting character. And they led this idea of spec-driven development. So what Jake Levine had said was that it's all about making sure that you have a really clean and transparency driven team. So if your team is in any way not transparency driven, if anybody's trying to slack off at all, if they're ever like not doing 100% and trying to drive everybody else to 100%, then everyone slows down. And so you go from being a 100x team to being like a 50x. And if two people slow down, then you're down to a 25x team. And like at some point, that's just too much loss, right? So it's all about like reducing that friction and really just being kind of anal about all those little tiny details.
That's an amazingly brilliant set of points that you summarized in a phenomenally short amount of time. So really appreciate that answer. I have a bunch of other random questions to ask you, but it just depends on if you have the time. Otherwise, we're totally fine because we've come to the top of the hour. Do you have a few more minutes, or do you?
Yeah,
How much time? Tell me how much time you have, and I'll only ask that many questions.
probably another 10 minutes or so.
Perfect, right? I think these are great. I totally appreciate your thoughts here. So these are a bunch of random questions based on some of the conversations we've had and some maybe we've not had. So if you could keep them, you're very quick, but you can keep them as quick as possible. I can ask more within the 10 minutes.
Sure.
The first of them is, say you graduated yesterday from high school. Would you go to college in 2026?
No.
Is there, other than one of those professions that we talked about, law and medicine, I'm just asking for engineering per se and non-engineering as well, right? Is there any reason that you can think of other than regulatory bodies, right? Let's keep it simple. You said no, just want to confirm one more time. Somebody's watching this. They have two options: spend money, borrow, going to college in America is very expensive, or go to vocational schools.
Mhm.
Any reason you'd say maybe consider college, or it's a flat no?
So the reason that people used to go to college was that's where all the people who are highly proficient in information transfer worked. And you could go to them and they were like librarians for specific topics that would know everything about that topic up to the moment. That's kind of what it is to get a PhD. That's why you become a professor and have a PhD and go to academia. I think the issue is that most of those people are not sufficiently proficient at gathering information in the modern world. And I would say that that's a handicap at this point. And
So
so,
in other words, simple. Alex wouldn't go to college if he graduated yesterday from high school, correct?
yeah, I went for 4 years and read books. If I'd been talking to agents that whole time, I'd be a lot smarter.
A great answer. I went to college 20 years ago. If I could go back, I'm not spending any of those 8 years back in college for sure.
Yeah.
The next question. You live in San Francisco, right? Great place, great city, great part of the world. We all know the Silicon Valley. Culturally very different, right? Quite different, right? I've spent some time there. I live on the East Coast now. The question I want to ask is, everything that you've shared, Alex, how much of it is Bay Area or San Francisco or Silicon Valley specific, and how much of what you think you've shared is actually applicable to folks who are outside that region, maybe outside that part of the country in the US, or outside America in general, maybe in Europe or maybe in Southeast Asia or South Asia, right? I just want to get your thoughts on it.
So I built my last company from a cabin in the woods in Canada during COVID, and I was successful at building it, and it went quite well. I think if I had come to San Francisco to do that, I would have had a more successful path. The reason is not what you think. It's not because of Stanford. It's not because of Berkeley. It's not even because of all the Bay Area companies. At this point, you're not going to really learn anything from those people. But what you will learn something from is all the other people who've also come to San Francisco to pursue some massive dream like that. So most of the team from Tribe are actually, like I said, people that we met in the kind of San Francisco hackathon scene. And those are mostly people who are extremely dedicated to their own efficiency and have, as a result, figured out how to use a lot of these tools. And I think that there's probably an existing community like that everywhere else in the world. It's probably just not as densely populated.
Okay, so but some companies that are moving out, like for instance, there has been a fair number of companies, right? I mean, I'm not talking just the Musk going to Austin or Oracle moving its headquarters to Austin. Do you see more of that happening, or do you still see this charm and influx of people coming to the Bay Area to actually want to start a life, to actually want to do these cool things that they had to do? Yes or no? And then I have a follow-up question to that.
I think the value of the Bay Area is a lifestyle thing at this point. The most popular reason that people come here is not because there's a headquarters of a big company here. It's because there's a whole bunch of VCs and there's Y Combinator and there's two of the best universities for this kind of stuff in the world. And that's the reason that the innovation hub is really strong. I think it's going to be interesting to see if the VCs and Y Combinator will also move out, given the new upcoming taxes and regulations. So we'll see what happens there. It would be a shame if it fractured, though. It's a pretty intense culture that I think is very valuable.
Great points. Last couple of questions. I have another 5 minutes to go here, right? So, outsourcing. I don't know if you've worked with folks in other parts of the world in an outsourcing capacity necessarily. Say you have or you have not. Given everything that's happening in terms of price reductions and AI doing a lot of the work, not needing to cut costs because costs are actually beginning to get cut to some extent because of not needing as many people. What do you see is the impact on consulting, the managed services business in general in the US? And what do you see as an impact, if any, on outsourcing? Two parts.
I think outsourcing where you're not working with a partner, where you're just delegating work to people, is probably going the way of the dodo. The thing that will hopefully grow in its place is going to be more local and direct economics. So given that we now can all build enormous amounts of software very quickly, the customer that we target when we build that can change dramatically. So rather than people in Bangalore building an app for somebody to sell in San Francisco to Americans, people in Bangalore should probably just be building apps for people in Bangalore, which is a very different environment, I think.
Which is, if you look at the stock share prices, a lot of these consulting companies, it is a reflection of what it is. The next question is, we are both engineers, right? We are in this space. So we have a certain thought process. We believe in what we're doing in the business of engineering and software. There are people who are skeptical about AI, right? For whatever reason, right? I live in Northern Virginia. We've got data centers popping up every day, millions of square footage, a lot of energy consumption, and everything that goes with that. I've read a lot of articles written by people who seem to be a lot smarter than I am that are questioning this, right? The viability of these data centers, the need for energy, the supply, sure. There are people who say that 3 years, 5 years down the road, you're going to have a bunch of million square footage buildings that are actually empty and don't serve any purpose. Do you have any skepticism whatsoever? Or are you surely in the Jensen Huang and Dr. Lisa Su and the Sam Altman camp, lock, stock, and barrel?
Coming from the crypto world, I spent the last 5 years working in distributed computing. There was already a lot of latent space in data centers. If you go to Hetzner, you can get like a sweet device for like $5 a month that costing from Amazon would probably cost you like $50 to $100 a month. So I don't think that there's I don't think that there is an overwhelming need for more data center capacity. I think that the reason that we're seeing a large data center build out has a lot more to do with geopolitical concerns. And it has more to do with stockpiling and moving chips to avoid some kind of perceived AI risk that the defense departments in each of these countries seem to think is coming. And if you buy all those chips and you keep the supply away from other people, that does also give an advantage to the people who have access to them. And I think this is coming down to more geopolitical lines and sanctions confusions than it is to actually the need to build out all this capacity. Like we said at the beginning, it's kind of unclear whether or not there will be a significant drive for increased demand for web-based services. And if there's not a significant demand increase, then we're just displacing jobs with these data centers. But it's not even clear if that is completely viable at this point. You still need an engineer to monitor your Quad codes. You still need an engineer to monitor your Kubernetes cluster and keep it efficient and that kind of thing. And even if you can do it all a lot more efficiently, you still need to actually pay a human at some point. So I don't think that it's going to completely replace things, even with autonomous driving. We talked about autonomous driving at the top. We've been talking about autonomous driving for software. I think with autonomous driving for cars, there's now been a whole bunch of unions and protests in all kinds of different places. Notably, Boston taxi drivers are a pretty intense, movie character trope. Boston taxi drivers are now rallying and saying, basically, we will not allow this. And it's ironically including all the Uber drivers in Boston. And so they're planning to have only a certain number of licenses for self-driving cars in these areas. China's already passed a mandate, I think, nationwide that's going to force a certain number of self-driving licenses. And I think that we'll probably start seeing that kind of thing happening across the board. It seems to be kind of where it's headed. So the question about data centers is probably a geopolitical thing. Somebody's got to buy all these Blackwell chips. As long as Jensen keeps building them, then somebody has to buy them. Otherwise, they go to the bad guy. or the perceived bad guy. And that probably means that we'll see a lot of buying up of all this data center capacity.
Great answers. I'm down to my last two questions. The last one, second last one is, so essentially what you're saying is with, Seagate announced the reported earnings today. They went up 20% on top of the 70% they've gone up in the last 2 months. Micron has almost doubled in value in the last 6 weeks or so. No different with SanDisk, not just the memory companies. You take any semiconductor company, they've all, it's been sort of a state of frenzy. So for somebody who's a little bit worried, as an investor, as a trader, who thinks, oh my God, things cannot be going up in value every single day. You have the market take a 200-point dive on one day, and the next 7 days it goes up as though, there's no other way for it to happen, right? So none of this, does any of this give you, even if you believe in the business of AI and engineering and everything, Alex, just the state of euphoria and frenzy, does that give you concern at any point of time, or you're like, nope, we are good?
I think the euphoria and frenzy that we're seeing is mostly a matter of the reshuffling of cards. So a large portion of why the market's been kind of crazy is that there are these really big contracts being signed. And that dramatically impacts earnings numbers and for the most part makes the balance sheets of a lot of these companies look very different. I would err on the side of every single dollar that's being projected will probably not be earned, but a large portion of it will be. And there will be these huge contracts being passed around. They might end up coming out of inflation. They might go into a quantitative easing bucket, but they're probably going to keep doing this because, again, it's a geopolitical concern. So if CoreWeave goes out of business, as an example, that dramatically hurts American competitive edge in the global world. So probably as long as this administration's in, they're going to keep supporting these companies. And I think what I would expect is that the next administration will be stuck with the problem of whether to crash the AI industry and probably will choose not to. I think at this point, the only way that America crashes their own AI industry is if some Chinese party gets into the US office somehow and decides that that's the right thing that they want to do. Because the only people that's going to benefit is an alternative leader in the space. So I think it's like a full ride till AGI from here. We're going to see huge liquidity going into these businesses, and it's probably very unlikely that they're going to dip.
Oh, really, really good answer and really specific one. So I have one last question, but before I ask you that question, do you have any questions for me?
How long have you been doing this podcast? You said at the beginning that you like this podcast because you get to ask good questions, and I think this has been a fantastic list of questions.
Oh, thank you. Well, I've been running the software company for a long time. 2 years ago, somebody told me, Chris, you like talking, you publish your own solo podcast, which is technical hands-on stuff. You might enjoy talking to people. And, he couldn't have been more right. I called the first person and, someone reached out to me. I'm like, you know what? I really enjoy having these conversations. Thank you so much. So yeah, that's the answer. Any other questions?
No, I mean, what do you think of the market? Do you think that we're heading for a crash?
Okay, here's my take on it, right? I live in the DC metro, so I go to DC all the time to create content as well, because as a small startup, to make our product visible, we do 7 other things that's not code related. Content creation is one of them. So I show up there every time these big CEOs go to the White House. I stand outside and you get lucky. They pop up, they show up on the outside and have selfies with like anyone you name. It's likely that some team member of mine actually has some content created with them, be it Dr. Sue or Sam Altman or somebody. So we enjoy doing this, right? One part of me is like, being in the business of software for like 2 decades, I love this and I see it getting better. Like I completely agreed with everything you said there. But the thing that I'm not necessarily convinced with Alex is the rate at which things change in certain businesses and certain parts of those businesses. It's not a good reflection, in my opinion. I have a lot of gray hair, as you can tell, a lot older, that it doesn't carry to the same extent to other businesses, to other people. That's why I asked you a little bit about the culture in the Bay Area, because I know a little bit about it. Things moving at a certain pace is actually quite regional, right? Things are not going to move at that same pace in every part of the same country, let alone in every country, right? Now, that's the problem. You have, there is already a lot of disparity in the world. There's 90% of America is not even in the stock market, from what I understand. The top 0.1% own more wealth than the top 0.9%, and they own more wealth than the bottom 90% of the country, right? And Musk owns more money than 53% of Americans, which is insanity when you talk about disparity. When that is true, you have one side people wanting to go to Mars and release like 1 billion Optimus robots, And the other side, there is so much disparity. People are not making ends meet, right? There's inflation to some extent. So I think there is going to be a disconnect. And when there is disconnect to some extent, it's all right. But when there's disconnect that's beyond a certain number, I don't know, right? I don't know what could, what is in store. So I think there's reason for caution. Was it Michael Burry or one of those guys who called out for Palantir and Nvidia, or them depreciating those chips at a slightly lower, at a higher rate than something else, and right, 6 years over 4 years, for instance, right?
So depreciation back quite a bit as well. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So it does give me cause for concern, but I understand that we're not living in a world that you could stay stagnant, because you stay stagnant, you're going to be left so far behind. And I'll just say one last thing as a response to your question. 3 quarters ago, give or take, when they asked Sundar Pichai, right, this Alphabet CEO, as to why he was spending so much money on AI, and Alphabet plunged in that. I think they were like $150 at the time. Now they're at $340 and within 4 months or so, right? Yeah. He had said something beautifully. He said that the risk of spending on AI is a lot lesser than the risk of not spending, right? And then there was a bunch of follow-up questions, and then the stock it dropped like 10% or some big number. Everyone's like, oh my God, Alphabet is going to become inconsequential. Fast forward 4 months, they're the second largest company in the world, right? So, which is why for anybody who wants to question AI, you have to be willing to put yourself in a position to question Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk or Jensen Huang or one of these people who've built these super scary and successful businesses, that you have to believe that you are somehow smarter than all of them put together. And when I ask myself that question, I'm like, you know what, Krish, they could be wrong, but you might as well be on that wrong side than on the wrong side of you thinking they are wrong today, right? That's at least where I stand as a person. Hopefully some of that made sense. It's just a bunch of words. 100%. Yeah.
I think to follow on with that, there's a really interesting argument to be made for green energy, which is that assuming that we all want to have more stuff, the cost of designing it with AI is significantly lower than the cost of having more babies and getting more people to do those jobs. Because humans create all kinds of messy things. We make a huge mess. We're very bad for the environment. We like to travel around on planes and all this stuff. If you get a data center with a chip in it today that takes 6-7 years to depreciate, and it's powered by a wind turbine, you've really actually done almost no harm to the environment. And these are kind of there's an argument to be made on that angle, but there's also the argument to be made that the world is a competitive place, and this is the first real competitive shift since the internet. The advent of computers that can the joke is that we made the rocks talk. We put enough voltage into the rocks, Frankenstein moment, and they started responding to our questions, and they're responding with good answers, and the answers seem to be getting better at an accelerating pace. I was having a chat with someone earlier today, and we noted that Opus 4.5 is probably the peak of reasoning. It'll keep getting better from here, and the models will get a lot cheaper to run is the main thing. And so we're going to see a lot lower compute needs and a lot lower energy needs to run the same model that's currently providing intelligence. And we're going to see them keep getting better, and we're going to be able to cluster more of them together. We'll get them to argue with each other. But the key thing is that the actual models are getting a lot thinner. So there's a client-side model from Chrome right now that you can run in the browser that's as good as ChatGPT was 2 years ago.
Wow.
That's insane, right? That's incredible. It means it runs on my phone. It's running on my phone. And that requires no energy, it requires no cost, but it's going to massively increase human welfare. It means that each of us now has a lawyer, a doctor, an accountant, all those things in our phone on that amount of compute, which is a spectacular improvement.
Amazing. Alex, I really enjoyed talking to you. If you ever want to come back on to do a hands-on session about some of these agents, definitely let me know. I'll be more than happy to facilitate that. We could just do some hands-on work as well. But before I let you go, the very last question is completely different from any of the other ones. What's your favorite food? If you have to pick one dish that's your comfort food that you would want to eat, when you're not wanting to make a decision, what would that be? And, given that our audience is fairly spread out for the most part, at least, if it's not an obvious, simple one, enough one that everyone will understand, you may have to explain that a little bit.
Okay, so it's pizza. But the thing is, I'm supposed to be gluten intolerant. I don't normally eat bread or drink beer or anything that has gluten in it. But I found out that Whole Foods has an ancient grains pizza. It's incredible dough. The dough is so good, and it's made with all this like flax and these different seeds that are actually like very healthy. So you can get these pizzas from Whole Foods, and they're $15, and then you get toppings added on top, and you get like 4 or 5 toppings. So I've ordered these things, and they're like, these are gigantic pizzas. Each slice of this pizza is like this big, and there's 6 slices, and it's like $15. It's incredible. So I pick up one on my way home often, and I'll pick one up for my girlfriend and I. We'll have a pizza together. But you get to pick the toppings. So every time I call them on the phone. I get to pick my toppings over the phone, and then I pick it up. And it's fresh, and it's at Whole Foods. So Whole Foods, they have like incredible groceries, and they'll go and they get whatever kind of ingredients they need from Whole Foods. So you can get whatever you want from Whole Foods put onto a pizza for like $15, which is incredible. My absolute favorite food. I get so happy when I get to eat this stuff.
Lovely. And what would be one country that you've not been to, or a place? It doesn't have to be a country. It could be another place in the US as well that you've not been to up until this point, but you definitely would want to see it at some point.
Does it have to be on this planet?
Wow. Maybe not. Actually, you know what? Why not? Why not? It doesn't even have to be on this planet.
There's a bunch of places I'd like to go on this planet as well. I've done a lot of traveling. I was nomadic for like the last 5 years, so I've got to see a lot of places here. I think the thing I would really like to see is to prove to myself that the Earth is in fact round. I would like to be in space looking at the curvature of the Earth, because I've seen that from a plane. But I'd like to know.
So like go to the International Space Station ish.
Just for like one night, go sit in like low Earth orbit, wait an evening, look out at the horizon, maybe have a glass of champagne, then get back in the shuttle and go back down.
Wow. Okay. I was reading about minimalism 2 days ago. I'm not going to say anything about minimalism now, because now travel has gone outside the country, right? It's gone outside the planet, I should say. But this is absolutely amazing. I really, really enjoyed talking to you, Alex. So by way of, again, reintroduction, folks, this is Alex Morris, Chief Tribe Officer. And, we talked about a number of different things. I'm going to include the link to tribecode.ai, Alex's company, and also the link to Alex's LinkedIn profile. Anything else you want to say as closing comments before we call? And if you could just stay on the call after I hit stop, Alex, for just a few seconds. But any closing comments?
If anybody here is using Claude Code and you want to try Tribe Code to get better observability of your agents and work better with your team, you can use the code Alex for a year free. Because if you've listened to me talk for this long, clearly you're a good person and we want you in our community. That's what makes it a tribe.
Awesome. Thank you very much. With that, we're going to end this podcast. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, everybody.